So journalists in Gaza absolutely need to be protected. When it comes to Israeli government investigations, you should ask the government of Israel that question. We obviously engaged with them about that and pressed for answers, but you are certainly welcome to do so as well. Those are Israeli government investigations, but we have made clear that when it comes to journalists, they need to be protected. I will tell you, ultimately, the answer to this is to get a ceasefire.
The Al-Quds Today channel is affiliated with the Islamic Jihad group. We understand that this channel received funding from the Islamic Jihad group.
So the BBC has decided to break its own record in touching a new law while reporting on the Gaza conflict. This time, its representative, Shaimaa Khalil, is facing the wrath of the news-consuming public on social media for her perceived justification of the murder of 5 Palestinian journalists by Israeli terrorists. Israeli forces on Thursday massacred 5 Palestinian journalists outside the Kamal Adwan hospital. These journalists have been identified as Fadi Hasuna, Ibrahim al-Sheikh Ali, Muhammad al-Lada, Faisal Abu al-Qusman, and Ayman al-Jadi. Al-Jadi in particular was waiting for his wife in front of the hospital while she was in labor to give birth to their first child. Moments after his murder, his wife delivered without realizing that Israeli terrorists had murdered the newborn's father. But how did the BBC report yet another war crime by the Israeli terrorists? Its online piece, written by Rafi Berg and Emir Nader, had this headline: 5 Gaza journalists killed in Israeli strike targeting armed group. Can you detect the mischief by these BBC representatives there? The headline has already exonerated Israelis from their criminal act, making it absolutely clear that the IDF was targeting an armed group. And the BBC does this without any attribution to Israeli sources. But the same BBC is always nimble-footed in adding attribution to Palestinian sources while reporting on the Israeli barbarism. The BBC didn't stop here. Its Jerusalem-based correspondent of Egyptian origin, Shaimaa Khalil, went a step further to enthusiastically highlight that the journalist who Israelis had massacred had links with Islamic Jihad, and their channel Al-Quds Today had even received financial assistance from the group. She, however, clarified that she was not in a position to verify these narratives.
One crucial point to add here is that the Al-Quds Today channel is affiliated with the Islamic Jihad group. We understand that this channel received funding from the Islamic Jihad group. But again, it is very difficult for the BBC to independently verify these narratives.
As expected, many are now calling her Benjamin Netanyahu's spokesperson. Twitter user Ahmed Suwehli wrote, and I quote, "Just watched a disgusting report by Shaimaa Khalil on BBC World where she sounded like Netanyahu's spokesperson, making excuse after excuse for the execution of 5 of her colleague journalists by Israelis in Gaza. Absolutely vomit-inducing. By the way, Shaimaa, you don't have to repeat Iran-backed literally a dozen times. We heard the first time. I'm no fan of Iran." End of quote. User Hamza Yusuf wrote on Twitter, and I quote, "In a BBC News report about Israel's deliberate killing of 5 Palestinian journalists in Gaza, the correspondent amplified Israel's propaganda about the journalists' supposed affiliation. They then added that it's difficult to verify these narratives, so why mention them?" End of quote. User Fatma El Isawi wrote, and I quote, "Are you BBC News giving excuses for killing journalists burned alive in their car? Shaimaa Khalil, whatever is the funding of the channel, they work for these are journalists covering the events when you are accepting to be absent from it. Shame." End of quote. Shaimaa works for the BBC from the comfort of Jerusalem. What would she know about the bravery of those journalists who have been risking their lives all through this conflict to actually discharge their journalistic duties. It's easier to work for the world's largest propaganda outlet funded by British taxpayers from the comfort of Jerusalem. In fact, she sounded more perverse and cruel than even the US State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller, who has been a staunch supporter of Israel's genocidal campaign in Gaza. Miller has always defended Israel's right to kill innocent Palestinian men, women, children, and babies, arguing Israel's right to defend itself. He and his boss, Anthony Blinken, have also justified Israel's barbarism on Gaza's hospitals, educational institutions, and religious structures. But even they have never been so brazen in justifying the murder of Palestinian journalists by Israeli forces. This is what Miller said only this month.
Just on Gaza, another journalist, a colleague of us, has been killed yesterday. That brings the number of journalists being killed in Gaza to 196. How many times we can ask the same questions that journalists in Gaza needed to be protected, and how many incidents we're still waiting for the Israelis to be investigated and for you to come back to us and said, this person's held accountable for the killing of Muhammad
So
Baluch.
journalists in Gaza absolutely need to be protected. When it comes to Israeli government investigations, you should ask the government of Israel that question. We obviously engaged with them about that and pressed for answers, but you were certainly welcome to do so as well. Those are Israeli government investigations, but we have made clear that when it comes to journalists, they need to be protected. I will tell you, ultimately, the answer to this is to get a ceasefire, which is why we continue to push for a ceasefire. The journalists that are operating in Gaza are doing so with incredible heroism. All of us in this room, including in many cases the United States government, know what we know about actions on the ground because there are journalists there that are reporting on it. The U.S. doesn't have any personnel on the ground to verify reports, so we rely on journalists to bring that information forward, and we rely on the work that they do. But as long as it is an active conflict zone, journalists are going to be at risk the same way other civilians are going to be at risk, which is why we believe the ultimate answer to this question is to reach a ceasefire, and why we continue to use all of the diplomatic muscle that we can bring to bear to try to get one over the line.
Sure. I mean, the reason I ask you is because the United States value press freedom and the work of the journalists on the ground, but we don't hear you condemning the killing of Palestinian journalists like you condemn the killing of other journalists in conflict zones.
We absolutely condemn the death of any journalist. We don't want to see any journalist hurt anywhere. Now, when it comes to the specifics of how any one journalist dies, while we object to the killing of any journalist, oftentimes we don't know the circumstance under which they were killed, whether it is an accidental strike, whether they were somewhere where they were covering an incident and there was a militant nearby. It's difficult to speak to the motives behind a strike when we don't know them, but absolutely we condemn the death of any journalist anywhere in the world.
I mean, what was this woman Shaimaa Khalil thinking when she uttered these despicable lines so enthusiastically? Does she not know that Israelis have massacred more than 200 journalists in this conflict? More journalists have been killed in Gaza than in all the other conflicts put together in the past. And yet, we have people like Shaimaa Khalil who will use any argument to justify these war crimes. Going by her argument, her employer, the BBC, is funded by the British government. The UK was responsible for the killings of over 1 million innocent civilians in Iraq. Would it be justified? I'm just using her argument. Would it be justified if one member or some of the members of those who lost their loved ones in Iraq to attack BBC representatives? Is she so thick not to understand that journalists are journalists? They're simply doing their job. Palestinian journalists are the bravest of all in our fraternity. The collective West have denied them access to food, water, medicine for 15 long months. And yet they have gone on with their job to keep us informed about the goings on in Gaza. Had it not been for their courageous work, the world would be so ignorant about the Israeli atrocities. That's it from me. Thank you very much for your support of this platform and our journalism on buymeacoffee.com and Patreon. If you too think that our journalism is worth supporting, then you too should consider becoming part of it. In the meantime, if you haven't subscribed to my channel, please do so, because that's one of the many ways you can support independent journalism. God bless you all.